Hello everyone and welcome to this morning's Onward event. I'm Sebastian Payne, Director of Onward. I'm delighted to be here to be discussing a topic that is very close to our heart, which is about maximising impact, or how we define success in making the UK a science and tech superpower. As you hopefully all know, Onward has a fantastic science superpower research programme led by Alan Nixon, our great team here, and getting the UK to maximise its potential, its science and tech, is going to be crucial for the future of our economy, for our standing in the world, and for trying to repair our social fabric, because we know that science and tech is not just a London or a South East thing, it's something that matters across the whole country. So today we're going to be unpacking this element about how science and tech feeds into a lot of the growth element for the economy. And we'll be looking at the 5 critical technologies set out by ministers and about how we get there and how we've got the right focus on the wiring in Whitehall, the investment ecosystem and the commitment to innovation. But crucially, just what is success in all this? Because we talk about it a lot, where we want to get to, because how you measure it is not the easiest thing to be done. But thankfully, I've got some of the best minds in the field on the panel to help us get through this and to try and get some of the answers. So to my left, not politically, is Andrew Griffith, who is the still quite newly minted Minister for Science, Research and Innovation at the Department for DSIT. Andrew's been a great friend of Onward and was previously City Minister and also worked in Downing Street, had an illustrious business career before he went into politics. On my left again, we also have James Wise, who is a partner at Borderton Capital, who has a big focus on AI sustainability and healthcare. And I think you're going to be very much bringing us in for looking at the investment side and where we need to get to on that front. On my right, we have Sarah Main, who is Vice President of Academic and Government Relations at Elsevier, which is part of the Relics Group, who are kindly sponsoring our event today. And finally, we have Heaton, who is CEO of the British Academy, which is, as you all know, the big academy for humanities and science research. And crucially, you're also chair of Our World in Data, which both during the pandemic and since is one of my favourite Twitter feeds, because I'm that kind of nerd and you are all here today. So we're going to begin with some opening remarks from each of our panelists with their views on how we measure success in becoming a science superpower and where we're doing well, where we need to improve, and we'll have a discussion here before opening it out. So kick off with Andrew. Would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you, Sebastian. It's a delight to be here, and excuse my rookie nature. There's a huge degree of continuity, actually, between the work that I was doing as Economic Secretary, as City Minister, which was mobilising private capital and harnessing that to the problem-solving power of business, entrepreneurs and innovators. And I like to think that in this new role, I'm pulling on the rope. Previously, I was pushing on that rope of capital, and now I'm pulling on the rope. The government, as you know, has some, and we're talking about measurements, so I'll sort of narrow down a little bit on that. But there are 2 sides of that. There are inputs and outputs, the outcomes. The big and exciting point about the domains in which we're working, whether it's quantum engineering, biology, semiconductors, are the outcomes. And they are quite broad. I mean, I'd love it, we could go away today and we'd all got sort of 5 KPIs, a balanced scorecard, AKA Sky. But of course, the exciting thing about this domain is it's changing every aspect of society. It's extending human life, the quality of life years that people experience if you look at engineering, biology and the life sciences. In terms of things like quantum and AI, it's superpowering the ability for machines in its broadest sense, robots, software, hardware, to allow us to be more productive citizens and engage more in society. And in advanced telecommunications, it is to be ubiquitously connected in a way that this beautiful young audience will never remember. But some of us are just old enough to cling on to an analog life before we were constantly connected. And we can see what a superpower that has been in terms of society. So when we think about outcomes, they're by definition quite broad. They're tangible. So when I think about our ability as a productive economy to generate new FTSE 100 listed companies, enormously successful private companies, to grow the base of employment so that we have that thing that successive prime ministers have talked about, a high wage economy that offers prosperity to our children and grandchildren. So they're very tangible outcomes, quite hard to measure, but we will be able to see that delta in all of those domains. We measure many things. We measure, the average life expectancy. We measure, the overall capitalisation of the FTSE. We measure the dispersal of all of your pension funds and what percentage of those are invested in illiquid growth scale-up investments. They are all measurable in terms of outcomes. Now, where we are right now is actually some very tangible input measures. We have the wonderful Science and Technology framework with a 2030 objective. Right? That's very clear. I mean, you can criticise government. People do all the time, in my experience. But in this particular domain, there is no critique of a lack of clarity. To govern is to choose. We've chosen 5 particular priority areas. They're in that document. And the time frame to achieve that is really quite short. We're talking about 6 years from the start of 2024, which is a matter of days away. So pretty clear and tangible. There's also, and I'll conclude on this because we're supposed to keep our opening remarks relatively short. There's a cultural piece to this as well, because you have to acknowledge that to achieve this vision, this strategy, we will have to change. Some of the ways we measure the success of research and innovation will have to change. So in the past, it's been overly about credentialising and citations. There's nothing wrong with that. Don't please take away out of context, new research minister says, there's something wrong with that. That is not the case. But in addition, we will have to spin up, and it'll be interesting to hear the discussion today, new ways of measuring outcomes, new ways of making sure that we maintain productivity in these research areas, that the very large volume of spending, whichever way you cut it, it's grown very substantially over the life of this Parliament. 20 billion, I think, is within the realms of dissent, but the overall amount is in excess of 36 billion if you add up all of what government, which is you, spend on research and innovation. The mix of that between pure research and innovation may have to change. You may certainly want to see a rotation of some of that spend. Still, and this is true of many organisations, particularly government organisations, the best predictor of where money will be dispersed in next year and in year 3 is where it was last year and 3 years ago. So organisations just have this great inertia, this momentum in them. And if you really are serious about a science and tech superpower, then ultimately you have to rotate some of the money in the system towards objectives and sub-objectives that are aligned with that. And then the final piece is that broader cultural piece across the whole economy, that we change our attitudes to taking risk, we change our attitudes to failure, because the process of innovation, cleverer people than me would tell me the process of research hypotheses themselves is that failure is endemic within them. It should be. That is the process of human discovery. But certainly, when I looked at the financial rules and regulations and the culture, and that was particularly post-2008, we have, as a society, not just rule makers, lost sight of that vital role of risk-taking. And so I have long advocated and continue to advocate a rebalancing, not at the extremities, but a rebalancing of society's approach to risk capital, and that should infect as well the research and innovation establishment, if that's the best collective noun. I'll stop there, Sebastian. As you can tell, I could go on. We've got lots of very specific, things in flight. All of the strategies now have been published. Engineering, biology last week was the last of the 5. All well worth a read if people haven't, even if they're outside your particular domain. And because I know I will get shouted down, if you're not directly linked to one of the 5, that doesn't mean that you're not extremely valuable. There's lots of other areas. It's just you've got to make some choices to try and move the puck forward.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. Sarah, would you like to kick us off with your thoughts?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. My name's Sarah Main. I am here on behalf of Elsevier. I'm their Vice President, Academic and Government Relations. And Elsevier is a company that tries to help researchers and healthcare professionals to advance science and improve healthcare outcomes for the benefit of society. And I think there's a really important thing at the heart of the question today about how the outcomes, maximising this success actually has tangible impact on all of our lives, the macro and the individual impact of it. Just to give you some context, Elsevier is part of a larger company, RELX. It's a UK headquartered FTSE 10 company, and it's focused on provision of data analytics and information tools across the economy, so in financial services, legal, risk, as you were talking about, and many more. Now, I'm about a week in the job, so forgive me if for some questions I might say, I'll ask a colleague, but I'll try not to do that too much. But prior to this, for 10 years, I'm very proud to have been the Executive Director of the Campaign for Science and Engineering. So today offers a great point of connectivity for me to bring some of the experience of that role of engaging with government and the science sector on the science superpower question and debate from that previous role with the capability of RELX and Elsevier in terms of informing this question with data analytics and information. So the question today, as you've said, Minister, is really focusing on maximising impact. And I really like that question because it really shows the move to this drive for delivery. If we have a clear ambition that's been stated repeatedly for a number of years now by government about the science superpower concept. But to move into delivery, we have to ask ourselves what that means, what are the outcomes that we want to see, and then how might we measure our success in that. Now, initially, the first conception of the science superpower rhetoric was quite tightly linked with the economic ambition to raise the contribution of R&D to our overall economy by more or less a double from 1.7 to ultimately 3% of gross domestic product. But obviously, the science superpower language is something broader than that. It's not just an economic input-output question. It has broader meaning. So I want to just tell you about something I did a couple of years ago, a year or two ago, with a colleague, Graham Reed. And together we thought we'd explore what this science superpower meant by doing a kind of consultation and listening exercise with various people in the sector around the country. And we used a scenarios tool to try to draw out from people what they thought the successful characteristics of a science superpower might be. And those scenarios were to achieve that economic growth by basically inflating the status quo in equal measure, or alternatively by doubling down and focusing on business investment in R&D in particular, or thirdly by trying to achieve this uplift in activity by pursuing national goals, so really driving on some of the government's flagship programs like Net Zero. And through that conversation we were able to draw out lots of interesting things. I'll only summarise a few, but some of the characteristics that we heard quite often were that a desired characteristic of a science superpower included things like global influence, for example, the UK's influence on research agenda, but also on research values and practice. It included encompassing all disciplines, so a very kind of broad understanding of what science and research is, including social sciences, humanities, arts, and so on. Importantly, that it would be self-sustaining, that this is not an economic goal that you want to achieve and then drop off, but one that you want to achieve and maintain. And that it was something that couldn't be conveyed or claimed by the government itself. You're only really a science superpower when someone else recognises you as such. So your peer nations or the public of the UK recognise the UK as a science superpower. It's not something that the government can just proclaim that it is, but something that we have to see that others recognise. I'm going to point to some of the things that turned up. Where, you talk to lots of people, you get lots of different views, and that variety of views pointed to choices, tensions, if you like, between different policy choices. And therefore, as you say, to governors to choose, it pointed to some of the choices that government might make in navigating the path to being a science superpower. So, for example, something around geographic location of R&D investment. Now, you could have a tension, if you like, between a free market approach, which says we want to really try and attract foreign direct investment, and therefore we will not constrain where that investment takes place in the UK, versus the levelling up agenda, which might say we actually want to direct business investment to certain places. So those two things present a choice. Again, pursuing national priorities, certainly there emerged a fairly vocal discussion on whose national priorities. So if you're in devolved nations, they might have a different perspective on some of those national priorities as central government. And different ways of achieving them. So engineering biology that we were just talking about, the Scottish government has a different approach on gene editing in crops to the rest of England. Nuclear power in terms of net zero, there are different policies around that. National security as a government priority needs to be, there is a balance, there is a choice there to be made in terms of the approach of collaboration versus how you align collaboration and security concerns. And finally, and I think to your point, Minister, that how you navigate a disruptive change, a transformative change, how you support insurgent institutions and technologies alongside incumbents. So, how you secure the strength that you have whilst also supporting new actors. So today we're talking about maximising impact, and I think that we are all agreed that the concept of impact in society is something broad. That, as I said, it has a macro impact, but it has an impact on individual lives. And so if we're thinking about measuring that, we need that broader range of measures. We don't simply want to rely on narrow measures that don't give us that full colour. We want measures that not only reflect the status quo, but also give us direction that can indicate where strategic priorities might be for the future. So I'll tell you a tiny bit about what Elsevier has been doing in this domain. Actually, Elsevier is recognising that citation measures on publications are somewhat two-dimensional, has been going through a broad consultation on how it might broaden those measures to reflect outcomes in the way that you were saying, cultural, economic, environmental, technological outcomes. And this has been done across a number of countries, and there is a framework that's been developed that encompasses those inputs, throughputs, outputs, outcomes. And that's something we'd be really keen to continue to discuss with government about how to use it. Finally, I'll leave you with some thoughts on how we can broaden the concept of thinking about our success as a science superpower across the whole economy, not just from the academic point of view. So we might think about how to make that more comprehensive. From a business point of view, there's already significant capability. For example, RELX that I mentioned has AI solutions that it can use in the areas of risk, legal, patents, and so on. And Elsevier itself has AI tools that it can use in research and in medical decision-making. So there's lots of potential there. Where we might be able to do more is perhaps business insights in relation to startups and spin-outs, use of innovation in business. In government, we have capability already to assess innovation in places. So an example is Advanced Oxford, where there was an innovation framework to look at innovation between government and academia in that environment, and that's being extended. And I think there's potential there to extend to assessing city deals, for example, and how well they are supporting innovation. So in close, I really welcome the move to thinking about what this success means, to being clear we have a coherent conception of what it is, and moving through to using the incredible capability we have to stimulate success and demonstrate that we've achieved it in a way that really has tangible benefits for all of our lives.
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah. James.
Thanks, Sebastian. And so my name is James Wise. I'm a venture capitalist at Balderton. I've been there for 11 years. So comparatively long in the tooth compared to some of the other people here in terms of the job. But over 2 weeks ago, I published my first book. So I've been an author for 2 weeks, which means
very good plug to get that in
which means that I can also say I'm a novice in some areas. But both in my work as a venture capitalist and in the book, my focus is on talking to entrepreneurs. So as a venture capitalist, I speak to almost 1,000 entrepreneurs a year. Balderton interfaces with many more than that. And in the book, Startup Century, I focus on this emerging class of people who will never go into having a steady lifelong career, that they go straight out of school, university, or something else to go and start something, become self-employed and innovate. And the good news is, over the last decade or so here in the UK, we've seen a big increase in both the numbers of people who are wanting to start businesses, who are able to raise capital to start businesses, who have the skills to do so, and the cultural acceptance of it. And I think you rightly, Minister, raised the sort of social risks of starting something else, social risks of doing science. And we're seeing very positive trends in that regard. And actually, overall, the science agenda is something I think the government can be incredibly proud of, what it's achieved over the last decade. But the world doesn't stand still, right? In venture capital, we benefit from that. We benefit from that disruption. And I think when you look at sort of both the inputs and the outputs that DCET and the rest of government have put in place, they're very welcome. But some of the things that I'd like to flag is just some of the theories of change that we're still holding on to, which may not be as applicable for the next decade about where science innovation comes from, as it has been for the last decade. And I think the Minister already made some nods towards this, which is incredibly welcome. So one big theory of change is just the university, right? The university in the UK is something we should be incredibly proud of. We've driven innovation through academic research for 1,000 years in some cases in the UK, and we continue to do so. But universities are no longer the only way that innovation happens. If you look at OpenAI, the business which has really driven the adoption of generative AI this year, that was a messy startup in a particularly unattractive part of San Francisco, building on the work open sourced by Google in 2017, right? So that's a large tech leader and a small startup. Maybe a decade ago, that would have happened, as Google happened, in the basement of Stanford University. But it didn't. It happened in a startup. But a lot of our innovation policy today is really structured around incentives to go and study at a university, right? Obviously, we all know that's the case through student loans. We know that's the case through access to some of the cutting-edge facilities that we have. I work a little bit with the Manchester Graphene Institute, known outside of Manchester as the National Graphene Institute, but we like to call it the Manchester Graphene Institute. And that's closely linked to the University of Manchester, as well it should be in some regards, but try getting funding to do graphene research in this country if you don't get the blessing of the University of Manchester. And so finding ways to make sure our theory of change encapsulates the ability of individuals now to do science through decentralized approaches and through access individually to facilities outside of the normal university structure is just as important as continuing to support the brilliant work we do with the universities. The second big shift I think I see, and once again I invest in startups, I'm heavily incentivized to say this, is our over-reliance perhaps on some large industrial players in the UK, right? The UK, once again, can be proud of some phenomenal businesses, especially in advanced manufacturing, JLR, Rolls-Royce, Dyson. But often, the field is skewed in the UK towards supporting those large businesses when it comes to funding science innovation. If you look at the vehicles that are going to take us back to the moon, us meaning humanity, back to the moon, or putting satellites into the sky, mostly they've been developed by SpaceX, right? SpaceX is a business which was predominantly funded, and the founder may deny this, by the US government. But SpaceX managed to get going by pitching the US government not on 5 years of trading history, as you would need in this country, but 5-year business plan, which showed that where they believed the technology was going, what they could achieve. And if you as a startup approach the UK government with a business plan rather than 5 years of trading history, it can be very hard to navigate the world of funding and support and grants. And I think the Minister made rightly a nod to that need to embrace startups and innovation. And I sit on a government board called the Industrial Development Advisory Board, an incredibly important board which oversees and provides private sector input into some of the big taxpayer subsidized industrial development projects we have going on in this country today. And we've got some great ones recently, big wins with Nissan, big wins with BMW. But the mentality of government in that regard is not to go and find the best companies in the world and attract them in. It's to be reactive and say, well, we're here, pitch us. And BMW and Nissan rightly know how to navigate government, and perhaps some of the startups and science innovators of the world don't know how to do that. And so doing more to make sure we're as open as possible to the innovators of tomorrow as much as supporting the businesses today, I think is really important as well when we think about that theory of change of going from inputs to outputs. And the final piece, which I'm obviously particularly interested in, is capital. So once again, the UK has been phenomenally successful at attracting FDI into technology and science over the last 13 years. When I started in venture capital about over 13 years ago now, the dollars invested, and it's done globally in dollars, into the UK was about 1/10 of the size as what it is today. So it's a 10x increase in about 13 years. It's a phenomenal success. We're still leaders in Europe, which is great at attracting capital. And the number of businesses getting started, as I've already mentioned, is at almost record highs. So that's all incredibly positive. When I look at the decade to come, there's some amber flags we need to be aware of when we think about financing science innovation. So one of those things is just there has been a global pullback in venture capital. Unfortunately, anyone who's read Carlos Perez's work on this, bubbles happen in technology. There's frenzy and there's synergies, and different periods of time reflect those. But right now we have seen a big drawback. The number of dollars being invested in the UK venture capital market in 2023 versus 2022 is down about 40%. And that's particularly acute at the growth stage. So when a business already has a product, it has a team, it's just getting going and it wants to go global or launch that second product, there's a particularly acute gap in availability of growth capital. And that's true whether you're a university spin-out or you're a person in a garage. And so we need to do something to close that gap. The UK government's pushed hard with this in its Mansion House reforms, but I think the former Chancellor was right today to say a voluntary scheme may not be enough, and we need to do more there. And I know that the Minister worked incredibly hard in getting that over the line in his previous role, because I've been talking to chancellors about this for almost a decade. And we're there, we're at the starting line, but we're not quite over it. And the real amber flags for me, and something that we need to be really aware of, is AI. So over the last decade, one of the great successes in the UK is fintech. We went from innovation to scaling, and we now are home to some of the largest financial service technology businesses in the world. And we did that, in my view, because we had a unique combination of three assets. We had great talent from the city and technologists through our great universities. We had capital at the beginning of 2010. We were able to get that into the country for the first time. Things like EIS, SEIS, although they're for the very early stages, were incredibly instrumental in that. And we had a supportive regulatory framework. AI is a different matter. In the UK now, we can be very proud of some of our AI advances, but actually in terms of capital is far more global now than it was a decade ago. And if you look at France this year, it will, in AI at least, probably surpass the UK for the first time in terms of allocation of venture capital. If you look at talent, once again, we're a great talent hub, but talent is very mobile. And once again, French University is very strong in this space. And so where can we win? We can win in regulation. And when I look at the implications of the EU Regulatory AI Act, with the outline coming out recently, there's a lot of concern for investors about what that will mean for being able to build an AI company there. We were home to the AI Safety Summit a few months ago. I wish it was called the AI Success Summit and that we'd leaned into what can be achieved with AI in this country. But I think it's one great example of where the UK still could have a competitive advantage in what will be one of the defining fields, not just of enabling science, but also deploying and building companies over the decade to come.
Great. Thank you very much, James. And finally, Heaton.
Yeah, thanks. It's always hard to be last on a panel of such illustrious speakers. So let's just bank everything that's been said. I sort of broadly agree with everything that's been said. And it is worth paying tribute, I think, to the creation of the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. If you remember back when it was part of BEIS, the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Department, the Secretary of State was always dealing with an energy crisis or something like that. Now we have a Secretary of State who can focus on science, and I think that is a really important positive development. I broadly agree with the kind of structure of what others have said. You've got to focus on the long-term outcomes, and we haven't. Sometimes we've talked about R&D as if it matters for its own sake, but actually we've got to connect it back to good jobs or dealing with net zero or the issues of AI, etc. So that's really important. And then, but of course, that feels, as the Minister said, quite distant from what we can measure and how the attribution, as it were. So you've got to look at the outputs, research, which you've said, one can measure on citation indices, etc. The inputs, we've got a great university sector. We've heard about the growth of R&D funding, etc., etc. But there's also something about the kind of wider infrastructure. And I think one of the things we've seen recently is a better focus on policy stability. I mean, if you look back over the last few years, there's been quite a lot of policy instability. And that matters as much as the financing. And I think we now see commitment actually from all sides towards much more stability, and that's very, very important. But I just wanted to pick out a few areas where I think there may be room for thinking about things a bit differently. One picks up on your point. What's the nature of the economy that we have? We have an 80% services economy, and sometimes we think we're Germany. I think that's the sort of model that sometimes policymakers have at the back of their minds. Worth remembering, our creative industry sector is £115 billion a year turnover sort of sector, which is bigger than automotives, life sciences, and aerospace. But you wouldn't think about it in the way that when we have conversations around where do we focus our policies, etc. So that I think is really, really important. And therefore thinking, as you would expect from the British Academy, about the range of disciplines that you need to focus on. So humanities, social sciences, and the arts are as important in this journey. And similarly, thinking about technology, you look back to, say, GM, we had the technology, but it failed because the public didn't support it. So making sure that we have social science engagement with the public on these things. Otherwise, AI may I was at Bletchley, and the conversation was not, we've not got the technology, it's how are we going to keep the support and trust of the public? What's the regulatory frameworks that we need? What's the ethics? So making sure that, and during the pandemic, we worked very closely with the Royal Society. The scientists were doing all the work on the vaccines. We were doing the work on vaccine hesitancy and how do you ensure the take-up. So the UK is uniquely placed because we're so strong on both the STEM and what we're increasingly calling the SHAPE, social science, humanities and arts disciplines, and sort of playing to that strength of having both working together. And I think there's a possibility that DSIT may be missing a trick. If you look at its objectives at the moment, one area where I think it could have a new objective, which it's already doing work around, is being the source of evidence for UK prosperity. And it already funds this through the Economic and Social Research Council and other bodies. And I'll give you one example. If you track back in history, the UK government funded a whole set of research around how did children learn to read in schools. And the answer was synthetic phonics was the best way to do this. Nick Gibb, as a minister, sort of really took this and sort of pushed it through schools. And you've now seen a massive increase in England's performance in the PISA tables. And I would argue that if you were thinking about what's the biggest value for money research that we've had, which is going to have the biggest change on UK productivity, is getting kids to learn to read. But there was no technology involved in that. This was a bit of social science research, as it were. There's lots more that one can do and is already being done. And I think the department positioning itself as the department for evidence, as I say, it's already funding a lot of this work, will be really, really powerful. And then I'll just end on a slightly different note, which is that quite a lot of what we talked about is utilitarian, and it must be so. But let's just not forget that we live in an extraordinary world. I mean, some of you will have been watching David Attenborough's Planet Earth. Lots of people are tuning into the Rest is History podcast. You look at the images coming from the James Webb Telescope, and one of the outcomes we mustn't forget is just the wonder of the world and the fact that R&D can help us appreciate that, because it's a kind of human thing to want to know more about who we are as a society, and R&D underpins that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heaton. Right, well, so much to unpack there. I'm going to come back to you first, Andrew, but one thing I just wanted to sort of pick up on the end there is, you know, we've had the creation of DSIT. I know you're relatively new to the department as well, and Onward, we've done work on looking at the Whitehall wiring in terms of trying to become a science superpower. If you were to sort of give a rating on where you think DSIT is, I know you obviously would say 10 out of 10, but if you were to give a where you think on the track, what more needs to be done, you know, over the next year, over the next period, what would you say are the areas of focus to try and get the measurements in the right place, to have the apparatus in the right place?
I'll decline your invitation to give my department Secretary of State a rating. But look, there's two axes, if you like, and I'll pick up to what some of the things that Heaton was saying. You've got our sort of functional, like any human enterprise, you've got our functional roles. So, there you look at the individual strategies, Eng Bio, quantum, semiconductors, AI, and those are all mid-flight. And now if you like that sort of thing, there are some quantified outcomes, there's red, amber, green status, there's Gantt charts. So those are midway through, and that's where they should be. They're all off the blocks. They're all got energy behind them. I think they're from all of my observations is they are very good for government in the sense that they've been properly incubated by external voices, working with academies, the science community. So those are all in good shape. The big, exciting power that's going to provide in the long term, much needed innovation across government. That's our sort of horizontal contribution. So with the department also of innovation, and that innovation is a leadership role across the functions of government, using science, using data, understanding pioneering innovation techniques. That, it won't surprise you, in my view, is much less mature. And I've got a number of little dip tests on that in different departments I've worked in, from having a look at the overview in number 10 as well. So that's a piece of work that I think we have a huge amount to do. If you look, for example, in healthcare is a really important domain for government. Right? Government spends £4 and £10 of the every pound that's in the economy, and the majority of that, the single largest category, but also a bare majority of that, is in health. And you're all rocket science in the room, so you all understand the compounding power of aging, new therapies, the genomics revolution. Right? So that is a massive delta there. And the ability of us to bring innovation to bear, this would be true of the Western world, there's nothing unique about the UK or the NHS in this respect, of the power of data, actually really connecting data, of bold, ambitious ideas of profiling, of being able to create personalized medicines. These are things where we, with an integrated healthcare system, should be, and that system, like every system choice you make, will have some disadvantages and some advantages. And the advantages of an integrated healthcare system should be that we can offer unique data sets for new therapies. We should be able to get those new therapies into arms and bodies more quickly than a non-integrated healthcare system, and we should be able to do that more productively, and by so doing, have a location, and we're about measurement, so here's an idea about measurement, which is the UK should be the market in which we see more novel but tested, to be clear, novel therapies, new therapies adopted than any other market. We've got the clear need state, we've got an integrated healthcare system, and we have a fantastic life sciences industry, which is one of three by any measure in the world, and the two others are China and the US, which have huge, massive domestic markets. So that's just an example, and if you scored, I won't put a number on it because that will just sensationalise it, but if you scored where we are on that particular journey, you would say, look, there's some anecdotes of success. Just look at what we did on the vaccine. But that was an exceptions process. If everyone involved in that will say, well, yes, but that wasn't normal time. That wasn't the normal process of NIHR and MHRA and NICE and all the rest of it. So just imagine if you could make the normal process
like
closer to that exceptions process that delivered those fantastic outcomes.
And that's absolutely what we've got to get to as well, because again, that showed that, a lot of the vaccine stuff was sort of in some ways circumventing the normal processes, but worked very well. And it was still within the structure of the task force that figured out ways to pick a whole bunch of things and narrow it down to the potential winners quite quickly.
Just one more, because I'm a machinery government geek, and we love the fact that DSET was spun out as its own startup department. But procurement is always the quiet revolution, right? It's insanely dull. I come from a business background, so I understand and love this. But small nudges in a procurement framework. James, you talked about this, disaster of you can only get on a government procurement roster. By the way, it's not just central government, so you can all point your guns at every different flavour of, because it's government procurement is local government, and but collectively we spend a vast amount of money. There are some really adventurous things that happen in government procurement. The new procurement bill, does unlock that prospect that you're not automatically, as a startup, disqualified if you don't have 3 years of trading history, which is like you couldn't design a policy better to try and exclude startups and innovators from that great opportunity to apply that innovation to what should be the biggest numerator, which is the state. I mean, much better than going around individual companies. If you can get the state to use its 4 in every 10 pounds of citizens' money, then you get some really good compounding effects. So that's just the other one. It's a sort of cheer for the point James made. But that would be a measure of success to me. If you looked at procurement spend and said, here we are in 2030, how much of that procurement spend is flowing to organisations that simply did not exist in 2022 when you sat here and talked about that bill?
Now, Sarah, just to reflect on some of this, you talked briefly in your remarks about what the lessons you've got from academia in terms of how you can try and get the measurements correct. Again, reflecting on where DSET is now, what do you think needs to be done? Where are the parallels and where are perhaps the differences as well?
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting. And just while I'm constructing some sort of answer to that, but I just wanted to endorse what the Minister has just said, because I think that the whole concept of the Science Superpower is transformational rather than incremental. And I think the procurement piece, regulation for innovation, agile regulation, the pensions and capital piece have the potential for that transformative change. They're one of only a few things that I think can actually make real step changes. And on the machinery of government bit, DSIT it is brilliant that we have a Secretary of State for Science, as you said, but there is both a blessing and a curse in there, because you want science and adoption of R&D to be government-wide, don't you? So I think there's huge opportunity for the ministers and Secretary of State to make that connectivity. And I think an example of where that could be really valuable is in the people space, so connecting with the skills agenda in the Department for Education, as Heaton's pointed to, lots of things about inspiring innovation and entrepreneurship in schools, and immigration, with the Home Office. There's lots of points of connectivity. But getting on to your actual question, I think so first of all, we need this kind of clear concept of the outcomes that government desires from the science superpower agenda. I think the government, has set out a number of those, but I think, really sort of taking a hard look at some of the choices and then setting out where, which direction it wants to go to, which sort of character of science superpower would like to be would be helpful. It seems to me that there is a body of long-standing and quite comprehensive work that examines the contribution of academia into research and innovation into the R&D economy through the Research Excellence Framework and through the sorts of reports that Elsevier has done for government for a decade on comparative indicators. I think, for me, there's the potential opportunity is thinking about that rest of economy piece. How do we get that concept of the progress and the opportunities in terms of business activity in R&D, and in terms of government's own use and adoption of R&D. Now there, I think, there are frameworks that we can look at, lessons you can learn from how the academic assessment has been done using quantitative and qualitative indicators across the piece, trying to focus on real world outcomes. But it seems to me that emphasis on the fact that government is such a big driver of R&D and economy, of small businesses, of this procurement potential, the R&D it does in different departments is hugely valuable in delivering public services quicker, smarter, better, right? So I think that's, to me, where there is examples, but less of a sort of comprehensive framework of how to do that. So I think that's really interesting.
Now, James, as someone who's written 2 books, I know it's very important to plug a book as much as possible at such events. But I want to pick up on this cultural point, because I know this is the topic you've tried to cover, is that you talked about OpenAI and that ethos you had in America, which kind of goes back to the start of Silicon Valley in the 70s and 80s, where you had the company started in garages that then went on to multi-million-pound things. We've had some sort of examples of that in the UK. I mean, like the one that comes to mind, of course, is ARM, which started from Acorn Computers in Cambridge and grew, and we can have a debate another time about how ARM did not end up listed in the UK and all that. But there is a much wider cultural thing that it's very hard to pick up a lot of examples of why I've had that in this country. Is there a particular British barrier to this? Is it about the culture, not just about the structures of Whitehall and the economy?
Yeah, so if you look at, so the book Startup Century it covers lots of different countries and tries to be comparative and thoughtful about things on a global level. And the UK is by no means at the bottom end of that chart, right? There are many countries which actively restrict entrepreneurship. The UK doesn't actively restrict entrepreneurship, and we've seen some great examples of how it's grown over the last decade. But my focus has been not so much on picking winners, because I'm a little bit skeptical about government being able to do that, but rather getting more people into the race. And this is where I think incentives are skewed. And then, Charlie Munger, who passed away a couple of weeks ago, one of my favorite quotes of his is, "You show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome." And if you look at the incentives in the UK to try and do something different, don't go to university, don't take a salaried career, do something really radical, they're pretty skewed against you. And some of that is cultural, for sure. And there's plenty of really good studies, by the way, and we can all be flippant about Dragon's Den and The Apprentice and say, well, these are a bit silly programs, a bit over-dramatized. They actually have a really positive impact on the embracing entrepreneurship from a young age. But as a 17-year-old in this country today, we say, we'll give you £40,000, the best of, to go and take this path, or you can take this other path. You can do an apprenticeship scheme, which I think is actually really, really positive and perhaps underfunded. But you take that other path, by the way, and you try and start a startup, you're going to struggle to get a bank account. We talk about debanking of politicians. Well, check out debanking of entrepreneurs, right? Small businesses. And even if you get a bank account, you're going to struggle to get paid because big businesses, by the way, can not pay you for 90 days if you're an entrepreneur. If I wasn't paid at the end of the month by 3 or 4 days, I'd start to get worried about the financial viability of my fund, let alone 90 days, which I know the government once again is pushing on this, is a challenge. You try and get a mortgage in this country when you've got highly volatile income streams. You try and get access to laboratories. You try and get access to advanced manufacturing facilities. There's a bunch of things where you are given incentives to play a very different game when it comes to science innovation. Go to university, stay in your department until you're long in the tooth, and then maybe go into the private sector. And we can talk about spin-out policy. Once again, that's been reformed recently, which I think means that we skew the field against it. And sort of even once you've got that company up and going, and you're starting to get going, you're doing some really interesting stuff. Once again, the incentives are slightly skewed. And the example that I have over the last couple of years is obviously R&D and full expensing. The full expensing strategy is a fantastic shift we saw in the last budget, or the autumn statement. But what we've done is we've cut R&D tax relief and we've increased full expensing. So I can now expense the chairs in this office as an investment tax write-off, but I can't expense investment in compute. Right? If I rent CPU from NVIDIA or via a cloud service from NVIDIA, I can't expense that, but I can expense a tractor. Now, I don't have a problem with people expensing tractors. I think in this country in particular, JCB does a great job. We've got advanced tractors and they're automated, fantastic. But once again, if you look at the incentives we're creating for people to take those risks and try something different when it comes to science innovation, and more importantly, probably for the UK, because we're very good at science innovation, entrepreneurship, which helps distribute the ideas through products to the economy, I still think the deck is relatively stacked against you. And it's a cultural thing, but it's also embedded in a lot of our institutions.
Great. And then before the floor, Heaton, I just want to come on to this point about AI Act, because now I could have done this to James as well. And it is very empowerable for innovation trying to get to this science superpower goal, because on the one hand, there was a lot of justified concerns about AI and where it's going. I'm sure you heard lots of those at Bletchley Park. But then there's also this instinct that a lot of people, I think, particularly on the centre-right of politics, are concerned about, is that we have a gut instinct to regulate everything in the UK, to make sure that we don't go too far and too fast. And do you get a sense that we're in the right place on that, on the wrong place on that, and how does that transfer to other things as well?
Yeah, so I think whilst there was a lot of focus on Bletchley and in a sense on sort of the frontier stuff, what's often got overlooked on this is the government's excellent AI white paper, which was published back in March. And this set out a really flexible framework which sort of says the technology is changing. So you can't say this technology is bad and must be regulated, and this one is good, etc. You've got to keep applying these flexible tests of, how do we have accountability? How do we get, there's a set of principles to think through, which are about protection but about innovation as well. And it's sectoral as well, which is really important, because how AI plays out in insurance can be very different from healthcare to the finance sector, etc., etc. So I think it's a classic case of the UK. We've got the policy broadly right, but we haven't yet operationalised it. And for example, every regulator is being tasked with thinking through what does AI mean in our area, which is right, but there's no additional money for that. There's a skills gap because, you look at trying to hire a data scientist these days, incredibly difficult. So I think it's operationalising what I think is a very strong policy.
And I think that, again, that definitely goes across the other frontier technologies as well, is that we've seen lots of stuff coming out of DC on them, but it's actually just getting it embedded in the system practically and culturally. Let's now open it up to questions. And if you could just say who you are and where you're from, that would be very helpful. I'll take the gentleman at the back there.
It's Joseph Robson from the Epoch Times. Just on this question of public uptake of new technologies, particularly around AI or emerging technologies in the science and health sectors, what would the response be to those who are hesitant about things that are emerging, whether it's new technologies in terms of medicines or whether it's AI, public reluctance? How would you speak to that? What's the best way forward to communicate with people on that?
Thank you. And I'll take this lady here as well, please.
Hi, I'm Isabel from Animal Free Research UK. So we're a charity that supports scientists to develop and use human-specific technologies like organ-on-a-chip and computer modelling. Clearly for us in the bioscience side of things, a key measure of success is whether R&D translates into concrete developments for patients. And we feel that these sort of new technologies offer the best chance of doing so. So I know that the Minister has already
Great. I think I'll put both of those to you, Andrew, but then I also might ask the panel as well on this question about people who are hesitant about this, because I think it's a very interesting one.
Look, I mean, I won't use hesitancy. I mean, my word would be trust.
Yeah.
Right? And trust is incredibly important. I mean, if like me, you broadly want to see near frictionless adoption of new technologies, because that offers the benefits that, in general, we believe, then you need to ensure that you do everything to foster an environment of trust. So what does that mean? I mean, it does mean that we continue to celebrate our democratic institutions. I mean, we are part of a miasma of trust. You can FOI, you can hold us to account in Parliament. I think that's a really important thing. I think again, there's always a yin to a yang. That we live in a world where there are fewer democratic states than when I was born. We in the democracy column have got to make that an asset. And it seems to me that the linkage of that asset is maintaining public trust. You can probably dictate things faster sometimes, but there should be a correction to that. The other thing is maintaining choice. I mean, philosophically, I'm a conservative. We believe in freedom of choice, and it's very important that we try and maintain. Again, I'll draw a little bit more on my previous role, if I may. But when you look at things like fintech adoption, all of the wonderful frictionless digital technologies that we can use for payment, that has to, in my view, go hand in hand with also what we did was put statutory protection of cash, on the by definition on the statute book, right? So you made very clear that there's these wonderful new forms, enjoy them, get all the public utility for them. But for those that are not up for that journey, or perhaps their particular needs, part of minority groups, not in the classic sense of minority groups, but people who are just old or unfamiliar or have a different attitude to technology, that choice will be there. Probably not for everybody, probably not for many, but embedding that choice of other ways, I think, is really quite important to trust. The third and final thing is just remember that that's a thing, right? Particularly if you're a policymaker, one of your roles, and that's why you do hear a lot about the regulatory side of things, disproportionately coming from policymakers, is because we have to own that KPI of maintaining public trust. There's not a lot of other folk that can do that. A little bit early, we spoke a tiny bit earlier. It's something where science developments should be our friend. The animal research itself, it seems to me, is a proxy, and it's a proxy in the absence of other well-developed, well-adopted alternatives. So the more that we can get those alternatives, I was up BitBio last week up in Cambridge, literally on an industrial scale, although that means really, really tiny, small things, but that's still industrial scale when you're manufacturing human types of cells. That's obviously a really great way forward for experimentation, because you don't need the proxy if you can get hold of the real deal, as it were. But I look forward to engaging further with you and many others.
Does anyone else in the panel want to come around this problem about adoption and trust?
Yeah, if I may, yeah.
Yeah, of course, we'll go. It's okay.
This is really relating to my previous job, but I wanted to share with you that the Campaign for Science and Engineering, which is where I previously worked, has done really the largest ever sort of public opinion survey on people's views about R&D. So that it's not exactly the same as their views about AI, but there are some parallels. And the findings are really interesting, and I commend them to you. So first thing I would say is that the public is a large community, and I think taking a more nuanced view about that is the first step. Broadly speaking, the signs that came out of the public opinion work was that there is a kind of positivity about research and development. People think it's important. They would like to see the government doing more of it. But if you place any pressure or tension on that support can collapse quite quickly. In other words, people think it's important but not necessarily urgent. So in the face of other important issues in their lives, be that cost of living or environmental or whatever, they may trade their support for R&D with another priority. And I think the thing for all of us that might advocate that research and innovation and its outputs in terms of technological innovation are broadly important in our lives is that for many people they don't see that connection. So they're not sensing in their views that R&D has a role to play in cost of living or in energy or whatever. They see them as sort of like a separate domain. But the findings indicate some really valuable ways to connect in a more kind of compelling, resonant way with people. Like, for example, connecting the purpose of the R&D in this case, or the AI in the case you're talking about, that people can relate to much more, or connecting the place of that activity happening. So, for example, the vast majority of people supported the idea of a research institution being built in their neighbourhood, in their local area, second below a school, but well above a shopping centre or a factory. So the sense of kind of, something to be proud of in your local area, very positive sort of pride when people heard about Manchester and its kind of great innovations, but they didn't necessarily know about it beforehand. So I think, I agree it's vital to maintain this trust, but I think actually doing more kind of creative work and thinking about how to do it, that is important.
I want to just get a couple more questions because we're starting to run out of time. Out of the lady here, the gentleman here, and then the lady here. So you go first, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, a great panel. Just can we touch on a few of the government priorities like supply chain resilience, international security, net zero? We haven't really talked about them in this, and you briefly touched at the beginning. But how should those play into this prioritisation? And specifically maybe to James, what more would you do to incentivise? Would you specifically try to do more incentives? I totally agree with you on the incentives, but what would you propose to government in a world of limited finance?
Thank you. The gentleman here.
I'm Benjamin Heaton. I'm the Director of Technology and Innovation at the Confederation of British Industry. So it was acknowledged at the beginning, obviously, that business is the largest investor in R&D and innovation. And I think I wonder about a measure of outcome success at the degree of engagement with business on these issues, what that might look like, and where you think the UK might be in terms of its quality of engagement with business on these issues.
Okay, thank you. And find the lady here.
Tanya Sheridan from the Royal Society of Chemistry. We have about 55,000 chemistry members as a professional body, a not-for-profit publisher, and with education work. And I was going to say that one of the measures needs to be that we're getting the right talent in STEM and in innovation. So what more can government and other actors in society, professional bodies, academies, businesses be doing to make sure that more people feel that science, technology, engineering and maths is for me, and to give people the confidence to go for those careers, but also the confidence needed to be an entrepreneur, because we support chemistry startups doing a really difficult job.
Excellent. Those are all great questions. We're going to try and rattle through some of the answers to those. And we'll start with this first one here. I don't know, James, if you want to take this one here about supply chains.
Yeah, well, more broadly, how do you increase investment across things like, which are priorities like supply chain resilience and net zero? And to go back to the previous point, just quickly, the UK is a phenomenal place to invest in fast-scaling technology businesses, partly because we do have a relatively supportive regulatory framework, but also we have a populace, a group of people here who want to adopt new technologies, right? ChatGPT, in terms of users per capita, is higher in the UK than the US. We were the earliest adopters of mobile, we're fastest adopters of e-commerce outside of South Korea, very fast adopters of neobanks. So it's a great place to invest. The challenge is when you then hit regulatory walls, and in particular shifts in priorities, right? So obviously net zero is a great example of this. I think everyone is supportive of net zero. It's when net zero actually comes to physical changes to your life that it becomes tricky. And ULEZ probably is a great example of that. People putting it into place possibly in the wrong way. And then you see a policy reaction, and then from an investor perspective, you're like, well, what am I supposed to be prioritizing here? Am I going to be able to invest in this country in 5 years' time if we're going to change the policy, the broader policy agenda? I've just come from the Harrington Review, which I was a contributor to, which came out this morning, and that rightly suggested, I think, that there was ministerial responsibility and actually cabinet level responsibility for increasing FDI and, just as importantly, domestic investment
Hugely important.
into the UK. And I think having a cabinet level member responsible, as I think that the former Prime Minister had Jerry doing from number 10, supporting
Lord
Grimstone, sorry, supporting work in attracting FDI to the UK, making it a cabinet level responsibility, I think would be really helpful, because it would ensure when we do have to make policy changes that there's a level of continuity and cross-governmental oversight, so that we don't only change a vast majority of policies which we want to attract FDI into. So I think it's a really important area. And the other thing, as I said, I think we can do more broadly is champion some of the big changes coming down the pipeline. The EU has clearly set out its agenda, if the EU AI Act goes through in the way it's currently formed, which is, I think, very heavily penalising of anyone trying to do anything interesting in AI and adopting it in any way. In the UK, we have a bunch of regulatory institutions as well, whether it's regulating self-driving vehicles or use of synthetic biology for synthetic meat. We have a bunch of regulatory systems in place. They do need proper funding, but it would be a mistake, I think, to say this is another technology which we're going to try and regulate from day one, rather than its application. And making sure that we're clear about that, I think, will attract more investment into that particular sector.
Thank you. I'm just going to keep these answers very brief because I don't want to make them late. Just no, not at all. It's not criticism. Heaton, to this point as well about skills and whatever. I'm sure this is something that you have a lot of course.
I think the ecosystem here, has been moving in the right direction. You've got a strong R&D system and good investment. The association to Horizon Europe recently was a real strong attractor for talent, I think. I'd make two suggestions. One is that if, as the Minister said, it's a global marketplace now, actually. So looking at the visa regime, I think we're now starting to hit up at a point where the visa regime is quite costly compared to other places. It's not the major sort of factor, but it's a friction, as it were. And then the other thing is actually just universities in the UK are now at the point where they're cross-subsidising research a lot. They're making a loss of £5 billion a year on research. Onward and I would both agree on this. There was something in an Onward pamphlet that we should move DSIP to become D-Suite, which is with universities back in there, because although James says, universities aren't the only place to do research, and I absolutely buy that, they're the major place at the moment, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact.
Thank you. And then finally, Andrew, so to wrap that up very quickly, engage with business, skills, and investment.
Yeah. Look, I think the RSC, I just happen to know that does a great job at outreach, and I just think that's incumbent on all of us. Government can take it so far, but chemistry is everything. So trying to build on, I do think the Prime Minister's focus on numeracy is really important, because it gives the confidence that is then a sort of pathway to STEM more generally. But we can all do that. That's a shared objective. In terms of businesses, absolutely. I mean, one of the key measures, ultimately, the government's putting more money than ever before into research and innovation. Amplifying that and measuring that amplification by businesses, including things like full expensing, will really help. But that's completely understood. All of these big problems in society, you only solve with the problem-solving power of business. That's its superpower. And then in terms of, we haven't got long enough for supply chain resilience. That is a complicated topic in today's different geopolitical world. However, the UK should be enormously well placed to achieve that. I mean, we're in, if you think about the UK sort of spine, we've got the closest relationship with the US, we're Five Eyes, we've just joined the CPTPP, we've still got de facto the deepest relationships with Europe, and we are an anchor of the Commonwealth, which is a third of humanity. So if we can't make things like the more complicated variable geometry of the world work as an advantage for us, then we really need something different. And then in terms of regulations, one of the cross-cutting things that this government is doing, and I did in financial services, is put on regulators who will always have an asymmetry. They'll always have a risk-off asymmetry. That's just human nature and what we do to them as a society. But putting a countervailing duty to promote economic growth and international competitiveness, I just think really helps tilt those scales back into a good place. So whether it's a particular sandbox for a particular type of technology, drones or engineering biology, whether it's an investment or a free port, just this sense of sort of slightly leavening the mix of regulation so it can be as much of a strength as a little bit of a headwind, I think has great advantages. I'll stop there, Sebastian. But
well, that's a very good note, I think, to end on.
Lots to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots to be done. I think we've also done a very good job of trying to dissect where things are going well, where there is more progress to be done, and it's great to have Andrew in DSIT pushing this forward. But if you could all put your hands together to thank a fantastic panel of Andrew, James, Sarah, and thank you very much everyone who's watching online and those who came in the room, and for you've supported our Onward events this year. We've got our final event of this year this evening. It's actually back here in this room if you just want to hang around all day, where we'll be looking at the future of conservatism, an event titled What is the Big Idea? And this can be looking at work from our Future of Conservatism project in our first paper about where the ideals and values for centre-right should go. So you're very welcome along to that. But if not, I hope you all have a wonderful Christmas, and we'll see you all in the new year. And thank you for joining.